You don't have to do a very deep reading or a very thorough analysis of the four Gospels to see that they are different. They don't say exactly the same things. Actually, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptic Gospels. That word synoptic comes from two parts. Syn, S-Y-N, means similar or alike. Optic, you understand, means to see. And so the synoptic Gospels sort of see the life of Jesus in a similar way. John, the Gospel of John, is unique from the other three. But all of them have differences. When the different Gospels describe the same event, it's clear that the writers were intending to bring out different details in the way that they presented the information. But when those differences are pointed out, skeptics and doubters claim that these are contradictions. They say because there are differences in the accounts, they are therefore contradictory. We maintain that they actually are not contradictions, but actually a careful analysis shows that they can be harmonized. Any potential contradiction is resolved. In fact, the information, instead of being contradictory, actually turns out to be supplemental. We get the full picture when we put all of the information together. An area of constant attack by skeptics and doubters and unbelievers has to do with the four gospel accounts of the resurrection of Jesus. And we want to talk about those in our study tonight, and Lord willing, we'll conclude our study next Sunday night. We want to talk about the resurrection of Jesus, and what we hope to do is to be able to harmonize the resurrection accounts. Now, this is an important study. It's important for all of us. We need to have full confidence that Jesus certainly did raise from the dead, but also that the gospel writers, when they give testimony of that resurrection, are telling us a true and accurate account. This is especially important for our young people. I got news not so very long ago about a young man who apparently has lost his faith. He was a Christian, but now has announced that he does not believe anymore, and gave as one of the main reasons why he had lost his faith that he couldn't harmonize the gospel accounts of the resurrection. He believed that they were contradictory one another. He couldn't resolve that contradiction, he claimed, and that led to him losing his faith. That's not the first person that I've known of, that I've known personally, who's gone down that road. And so I think it's important for us to study this for ourselves, for our young people, to have confidence in the Scriptures. To our young people, I want to especially say, whenever criticisms of the Bible like this come up, be it about the resurrection or anything else, I want you all to know that those who would offer these criticisms of the Bible, they're not coming up with anything new. These attacks against the Scripture are not new. People have not discovered new information. They've not come up with something that nobody ever thought of before. And all of the arguments that they might offer have been answered thoroughly for centuries. And so I just hope that you will not have your faith shaken if someone comes along and says, you know, of course, that the resurrection accounts are contradictory. Someone may very well say that to you. And I want you to know that's not, first of all, it's not true. And secondly, they haven't discovered something that nobody else ever stumbled upon. These are old accusations. They've been around for a long time. They've been thoroughly dealt with and answered. If your faith is challenged, I'd say again to our young people in particular, if your faith is challenged, if a question is raised and maybe you don't know the answer to it, that's okay. Ask for help. Get assistance. There are answers to these kinds of questions, and we urge you to ask those questions. And so for our study tonight, and again, what we hope and intend is that this will be a two-part study. What we want to do is talk about harmonizing the gospel accounts concerning the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We stop here just briefly to say thank you to you all for being here. On this beautiful Lord's Day in Middle Tennessee, we have the additional privilege of spending an extra hour worshiping this evening as we've come together. Thank you for being here to be a part of it. Thankful to those of you who are visiting. As has already been said, we're glad you're here, and we want you to come back every time you have a chance to be here. All right, so what will we say about harmonizing the resurrection accounts? First of all, we acknowledge, and it would be foolish to do otherwise, we have to acknowledge that there are differences in the four gospel accounts of the resurrection. Again, you don't have to read very thoroughly or very deeply. You don't have to study that for very long to realize that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the stories they tell about the resurrection are slightly different from one another. They're not identical. So there are differences. Now, unfortunately, skeptics claim that these are irreconcilable contradictions. In other words, they say, okay, that just blows up the whole thing. That just proves that the New Testament itself cannot be trusted. Nothing about it can be believed. They claim that these supposed contradictions in the resurrection accounts undermine the credibility of the entire New Testament. I want to give you some examples of what they have to say. Now, I'm going to offer you these examples, these quotes from some of these skeptics and doubters, just to prove that this kind of criticism has been around for a long time. Paul Wilhelm Schmeidel, I guess is how you say that. This guy was a radical German theologian. He lived back in the 1800s. So he lived close to 200 years ago. And he said the Gospels exhibit contradictions of the most glaring kind. Remarus enumerated 10 contradictions, but in reality their number is much greater. He was talking about the resurrection accounts. There's all kinds of contradictions, he said. A fellow named Henry Alford, you may have heard of that name. He was an English scholar. He also lived back in the 1800s, and Alford said, of all harmonies, those of the incidents of these chapters are to me the most unsatisfactory, dealing with the resurrection. They seem to me to weaken instead of strengthening the evidence. I have abandoned all idea of harmonizing throughout. And so here's a guy claimed he pretty highly regarded English scholars. I've just given up any hope of reconciling or harmonizing the gospel accounts. Here's another quote. This fella, Percival Gardner Smith, was another liberal theologian. I think it's interesting that these attacks against the Gospels are coming from people who claim to be students of God, theologians. This liberal guy says, no ingenuity can make the narration of Luke consistent with that of Mark, much less is it possible to reconcile the picture presented by the fourth evangelist, John, with the accounts of any of the synoptic writers. Mutually contradictory narratives cannot all be true. Nothing can be made of a jumble of contradicting statements. Well, he's pretty straightforward in what he believes, isn't he? He believes that this is just impossible to straighten out. It's a jumble of contradictory statements. And one more. Arthur Michael Ramsay was a bishop in the Church of England. Actually, he served as the Archbishop of Canterbury from 1961 until 1971. So this is closer in time to us, right? Just within the last century, 50 years or so ago. Here's what he said. It is a fascinating study to attempt to harmonize what the evangelists tell. Up to a point, the attempt may be successful, but a limit to the success is always reached. That we should expect to be able to weave the stories into a chronological and geographical plan seems inconceivable. He says, to me, it just seems, you couldn't even imagine that you could straighten it all out and get it into a concise storyline, a harmonious study or storyline. So we just offer those quotes not to promote their skepticism, but to illustrate that these kinds of criticisms have been around for a long, long time. I just think it's unfortunate when someone in our day and age, maybe a young person or someone else, comes across some of this information and suddenly they feel like they have discovered something that nobody else ever knew about before. That's not so. These things have been studied by very intelligent people for a really long period of time. We want to talk about how we can harmonize the resurrection accounts. But first of all, let me give you an example of some of the kind of things that they call contradictions. In other words, notice I've put that in quotation marks. They call them contradictions. We don't think that they are. We believe we can explain them thoroughly, but I just want to illustrate to you what they think some of these terrible, irreconcilable contradictions are. For instance, they have a problem trying to figure out who it was exactly who came to the tomb of Jesus. Let me show you what they mean. In Matthew 28, verse 1, in the end of the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week, came Mary Magdalene and the other Mary to see the sepulchre. So we got Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. Matthew mentions two people. In Mark chapter 16, verse 1, when the Sabbath was passed, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome had brought sweet spices that they might come and anoint him. So Mark says there were three. Luke, in Luke 24, verse 10, says it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James. So there's Joanna. And other women that were with them, which told these things to the apostles. And so Luke mentions more than three. The three he does mention are different than the three that Mark mentions. And then finally John. In John 20, verse 1, the first day of the week cometh Mary Magdalene early, when it was yet dark, unto the sepulchre, and seeth the stone taken away from the sepulchre. John mentions just one. Now, you see what we're talking about here. These accounts are not identical, are they? They're not the same. Matthew says two, Mark says three, Luke says more than three, and a different three than Mark mentions, and John says only mentions one. You see a problem with that? Is there a problem? Have we got a contradiction? Hang on to that. We're going to illustrate some more of these before we get around to trying to answer, okay? So not only who came to the tomb, but the question is, when did these women come to the tomb of Jesus? Let's go back to the gospel accounts again. Matthew 28, verse 1. It says, in the end of the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week, came Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. So as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week. Mark says, Mark 16, verse 2, very early in the morning, the first day of the week, they came to the sepulchre at the rising of the sun. Well, that's a little different. Luke says, now upon the first day of the week, very early in the morning, they came to the sepulchre bringing spices which they had prepared, and certain others with them. And then John says, the first day of the week cometh Mary Magdalene early, when it was yet dark, unto the sepulchre, and seeth the stone taken away. Now, what was it? It was early in the morning, at the rising of the sun, Mark says, but John says it was still dark when this happened. Can you handle that? Is that a contradiction? What do you think about that? These are the kind of things that some of these supposedly very knowledgeable theologians, they just get all wound up about this. My guess is that you can already see through some of this. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But these are the kind of things that are supposedly irreconcilable contradictions. Who came to the tomb? When did they come to the tomb? When was the stone moved? Is another question. All right, we keep coming back to the same verses, obviously. Matthew says that when Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to the sepulchre, behold, there was a great earthquake, for the angel of the Lord descended from heaven and he came and rolled back the stone from the door and sat upon it. And so Matthew's account seems to suggest that the women were there, that they actually witnessed the angel rolling the stone back from the tomb of Jesus. I mean, you could read it that way, and my thinking is, at first blush, the first reading of that, that's probably the impression that you would get, that the stone wasn't rolled away till the women got there and saw it happen. But look what Mark says. Mark 16, very early in the morning, the first day of the week, they came to the sepulchre, and they said among themselves, who shall roll us away the stone from the door of the sepulchre? And when they looked, they saw that the stone was rolled away. When they looked, it was already rolled away, it says. In Luke 24, verse 1, now upon the first day of the week, very early in the morning, they came to the sepulchre, and they found the stone rolled away from the sepulchre. And John's account says, the first day of the week cometh Mary Magdalene early, when it was yet dark, to the sepulchre, and seeth the stone taken away from the sepulchre. These three accounts are all clearly saying the stone was already rolled away when the women got there. Matthew's account could at least be read in such a fashion to suggest that the women saw it happen. It hadn't happened when they got there, but they saw it happen when they got there. Now, what about that? Have we got a terrible, awful contradiction in the Scriptures or not? Another question. How many angels were there involved in this business of the resurrection? What does Matthew say? Behold, there was a great earthquake, for the angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone from the door and sat upon it. And the angel answered and said to the women, Fear not ye, for I know that ye seek Jesus, which was crucified. He's not here. Matthew says there were one. In Mark chapter 16, entering into the sepulchre, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, clothed in a white garment. And he said to them, Be not afraid. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, which was crucified. He's risen. He's not here. A young man, he said. Mark seems to go with the number 1 also, doesn't he? But look at Luke. In Luke chapter 2, beginning verse 4, it came to pass, as they were much perplexed thereabout, behold, 2 men stood by them in shining garments, and as they were affrighted, bowed their faces to the earth. They, that is, these 2 men, let me see if I can get rid of that, said, Why seek ye the living among the dead? He is not here, but is risen. Luke suggests at least 2. All right, so Matthew and Mark speak of only 1. Luke clearly, definitely mentions 2. Have we got a problem there? And then finally, and I don't want to wear you out with this, but finally, the question, when and where did Jesus appear to the women? When did they actually see him? Well, Matthew says that when this all happened, the women departed quickly from the sepulchre with fear and great joy and did run to bring his disciples word. And as they went to tell his disciples, behold, Jesus met them. So, as they went to tell the disciples, so they were at the tomb, they saw the stone rolled away. They left there to go tell the disciples, and as they were going to tell the disciples, Jesus appeared to them. Now, the other account that mentions the appearance of Jesus is in John 20, and this one's different. There's no doubt that this is different. The first day of the week cometh Mary Magdalene early when it was yet dark to the sepulchre, and seeth the stone taken away from the sepulchre. Then she runneth and cometh to Simon Peter and to the other disciple. So they ran both together, and the other disciple did outrun Peter and came first to the sepulchre. Then the disciples went away again to their own home. But Mary stood without at the sepulchre weeping. She turned herself back and saw Jesus standing. John has Mary seeing Jesus after they'd already gone to town, told the disciples. Peter and John run out there. They investigate the scene at the tomb. They leave. Mary lingers. Then she sees Jesus. Well, that's different. That's clearly different than what Matthew says, right? But is it a contradiction? That's the big question. All right. So you get the idea that there are numerous differences. We would all agree. There's not any of us here who would disagree. We would all acknowledge that the 4 gospel accounts contain differences in the details that they offer. I would say that these differences that we've tried to highlight here are significant differences. We don't deny that. But the question is, how do we address these? And do they constitute irreconcilable differences that undermine the credibility of the entire New Testament? Because that's what some of those skeptics said, right? Our question is it of that nature? So how are we going to go about harmonizing the resurrection accounts? Well, I think there are some principles that we want to apply that help us in harmonizing these things. And again, I don't want to leave the impression that we're faced with questions we can't answer. I don't want to leave the impression that we give credence to these skeptics when they criticize the resurrection accounts. I believe we can harmonize these accounts. And to do so, we got to remember certain valuable principles. First of all, these accounts are independent and not identical. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they didn't get together after the resurrection and say, hey, listen, guys, let's meet over at the coffee shop tomorrow. We need to have a meeting because we're gonna all write about the resurrection. We got to make sure we're all writing the same thing, okay? So let's have a meeting. It won't take too long, perhaps, but we need to get our heads together and make sure that when we write about this, we all write exactly the same thing. They didn't do that, obviously. They did not sit down. In fact, if all of the gospel accounts were absolutely identical, then we wouldn't need three of them, right? If they were all absolutely identical, one would be enough because the others would just repeat exactly the same information. We wouldn't need three, we would have just one. But here's an interesting thing to consider. If the resurrection accounts were absolutely identical, you know what that would provoke? That would provoke the skeptics to say, there's been collusion here. They conspired to put together this story. Look how identical they all are. That proves that they actually were trying to pull a trick on us when they wrote these accounts. And so it's almost a no-win situation, isn't it? If they're not identical, then they're contradictory. But if they were identical, there'd be collusion. For these people, we've got an almost impossible challenge to satisfy them. It almost reminds you of some of the kind of political intrigue that goes on in Washington, D.C., doesn't it? A no-win situation. But the accounts are independent. They are not identical. We understand that. The accounts are not intended to be read as comprehensive. And it's really wrong for us to read any one of the four gospel accounts as being the story that tells everything in perfect detail. And interestingly, John himself actually acknowledged that. In John chapter 20, you remember what he said in verses 30 and 31. John 20 verses 30 and 31. Many other signs truly did Jesus in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, Son of God, and that believing you might have life through his name. And so John, they're not trying to pull the wool over our eyes here. John admitted, we're not giving you every bit of information. They are not to be read as comprehensive. That is, when we say that, we mean they're not to be read as though they contain every bit of detail. So if someone doesn't give all the detail, does that mean that they're lying to us? If they are not comprehensive accounts, does that mean that the writers were intentionally trying to lie and deceive us? Let me give you an illustration. I was over at Walmart. This is not true. This is a made-up illustration. I was over at Walmart the other day, and I saw James Mayberry there. And I talked to him for a minute. So I tell that to Mark. And then later, I tell Bob, I was at Walmart the other day, and I saw James and Amy over there. Well, wait a minute. Those two stories are not the same. There's a difference in detail there, right? Well, I may have seen a lot of other people there too. I'm not necessarily intending to give a comprehensive story of everything that happened while I was at the Walmart store. But I'm not lying when I tell one person I saw James and I tell the next person I saw James and Amy. That's not a lie. Because neither of those is intended to be comprehensive of everything that happened while I was at Walmart. You get the point. Now you got to keep that in mind. So the accounts are independent. They're not identical, obviously. None of them were intended to be total and comprehensive, including every kind of detailed specific about the resurrection. The third principle is that we should actually expect there should be some differences in these accounts. If they are independent, not identical, if they're not comprehensive, then point 3 actually follows. That we would certainly expect that there would be some differences in the accounts. For instance, we'll talk about it for instance in a minute, but the point of the matter is that differences do not make contradictions. In a courtroom trial, think about this. In a courtroom trial, let's say there's a murder trial underway and they've got 4 people who witnessed the murder. And the prosecuting attorney is going to call all 4 witnesses to the witness stand, and they're going to tell their story about what they saw, what they heard, what they witnessed when the murder took place. Well, these 4 witnesses would be independent. We would not think them to tell an identical story, we would not think that any of them has every bit of information. Therefore, we would expect that there would be some differences in the things that they tell, but that does not make their testimony unreliable or unbelievable. See what I'm saying? Just because there are differences, in fact, differences should be expected. Back to our previous point, if there weren't any differences, then you'd say somebody's been coaching these witnesses. There's some dirty practices underway here, because these witnesses are testifying so identically that someone must have coached them as to what they should say. That would raise suspicion, wouldn't it? So we should actually expect that there would be some differences. And then finally, not every difference is a discrepancy. This is a really important point. Are there differences? We've acknowledged from the start of our lesson tonight, yes, there are differences. We acknowledge that. But not every difference is a discrepancy. Just to give you a quick for instance, we're going to try to deal with all of those things we mentioned earlier, all those things that the skeptics bring up. We're going to try to deal with them next week, Lord willing. But just as a for instance, what about the angels at the tomb? Remember, Matthew and Mark said there was just one, or only mentioned one. They didn't say there was just one. They mentioned only one. And Luke mentioned two. Now, that's a difference, but that's not necessarily a discrepancy, right? It's a difference, not a discrepancy. Let me see if I can illustrate it this way. Let's say we're talking as we're coming in here this evening, and I said, a man showed up at my house yesterday from Publishers Clearinghouse, and he gave me a check for $1 million. Well, that'd be amazing. Do you think that ever happens, actually? I suppose it does. But so I told you, a man showed up at my house yesterday from Publishers Clearinghouse, and he gave me a check for $1 million. Well, then, while I'm talking to you over here, somebody is talking to Cindy over there. And Cindy says, a white van pulled up at our house yesterday, and it had Publisher Clearinghouse written on the side of it. And a camera crew jumped out, and a man holding a mic came to the front door. There was actually also a reporter from the local paper, and they had this great big cardboard sign that looked like a check written out to me and Greg, and it said $1 million, Publisher Clearinghouse. What about those two stories? Well, there are a lot of differences in those two stories, right? Between what I said and what Cindy said happened. I suggested there was just one person, or I only mentioned one person. A guy from Publisher Clearinghouse came to my house and gave me a check for $1 million. I mentioned only one person. Cindy mentioned a whole bunch of people. The man, the camera crew, a reporter from the local paper, and so forth. There's differences, but there's no discrepancies. I don't think anybody, no right-thinking person at least, would say, Greg and Cindy are a pack of liars. They're telling whole different stories about what happened on this Publisher Clearinghouse thing. Nobody would say that. But that's basically what we've got people saying about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's basically what we have there. All right, let's stop right there. And next week what we want to do, Lord willing, is we want to reconstruct the events and account for the details that are given in the different gospel accounts. And we want to, and we believe we can, harmonize the resurrection accounts. Really an important study. Our faith in the resurrection has got to be rock solid. We have to believe everything the Scripture tells us about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Really, our faith hinges upon being able to prove that Jesus resurrected from the dead. If Jesus didn't resurrect from the dead, then everything we're doing here is just a waste of time. We might as well just shut off the lights, lock the doors, go home and never come back if Jesus didn't resurrect from the dead. That's how important knowing about that and being confident in the information, that's how important it is. And so this is a worthy study. And I want you young people in particular to pay close attention. We keep hearing about young people who are having their faith shaken about this sort of evidentiary study. And we want you to be very well grounded and know for sure what you believe and what. All right, thanks for listening. We're going to, hopefully, Lord willing, we'll try to conclude this study next Sunday evening. We're going to sing a song of invitation. As we sing this song of invitation, we'll be asking everybody, make sure your life is right with God. If that means you need to obey the gospel plan, hear, believe, repent, confess, be baptized. If you need to do that, we're anxious to assist you. We'd be glad to study more with you. If you are a Christian, you need the prayers of the saints, let us know. We'd be glad to pray with you and for you. Let us know while we stand and sing this song.
Not till God says the same.